Thank you so much, and welcome everyone, and thanks especially to the Clean Energy Solutions Center for hosting this webinar. I'm William Brent from Power for All, and before we jump into the discussion of our Powering Jobs Census findings, I wanted to provide a very short overview of the Power for All vision, organization, and strategy. Power for All is focused on ending energy poverty by accelerating the role of distributed renewables, which data shows are the fastest, most cost-effective way to democratize energy access. Access to energy, we believe, is a basic human right, but it is also only just a means to an end. And that end is creating economic and social opportunity for a generation of youth, women, farmers, and others who have waited decades to gain access to electricity. By doing this, it offers a greater opportunity to transform rural communities by enabling scale in agricultural production as well as other non-farm related livelihoods. And similar to the revolution in mobile telephony, we believed decentralized renewables are following a similar path through innovative hardware, software, public-private partnerships, easy payment solutions, and other innovations. So how does Power for All achieve its goals? It starts with building a multi-stakeholder coalition. We're now more than 300 strong organizations of leading private sector companies, multilateral agencies, civil society groups, funders, donors, investors, and research organizations. And our approach starts with evidence-based research, advocacy, and communications, and if we're successful, ends with a shift in the status quo to creating a new approach and moving away from business as usual. We also take an ecosystem approach that identifies barriers to market growth and works to remove them through multi-stakeholder engagement. Our two-year strategy is focused on strengthening our research platform called PEAK, expanding our market activation approach to 25 countries by 2025, and demonstrating the power of integrated energy and how that can create the utility of the future, and quantifying the socioeconomic impact of energy access, starting with work and jobs, which we'll talk about in a minute. So please join us. You're welcome to become a partner, sign up for our newsletter and social media toolkits, share your content, particularly video and photos, which are always in high demand from our team, contribute thought leadership articles to our various media channels, etc. Thanks, and with that, I'll hand over to my colleague and lead author of our Powering Jobs Census, Dr. Rebekah Shirley.
Thank you, William. I'm going to introduce her real quick for you. One second. Perfect. Awesome. So next we're going to have up is Dr. Rebekah Shirley. She was named Outstanding Young Leader in Energy in Africa Utility Weeks 2018 and works towards better access to high-quality energy data and insight for the sector as a Chief Research Officer at Power for All. Rebekah holds a PhD from Berkeley and a Master's in Energy and Resource as well as Civil Engineering. In addition, she's a visiting research fellow at Strathmore University in Nairobi, Kenya, where she currently resides. And with those introductions, I'm going to introduce you to Rebekah. Let me share your screen here in just a second, okay?
Sure.
Awesome. There you go.
Okay. Are you seeing?
Perfect. Yes, we can see your screen.
Excellent. And can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you just fine.
Excellent. Thanks a lot for that introduction, Camria, and thanks for setting up the conversation, Will, about Power for All and the work that we do. My name is Rebekah, and I'm the Director of Research at Power for All. As Will was saying, we have a big part of our campaign, and one of our campaign is evidence-based. So all of the things that we try to promote and advocate for through the campaign, we always try to make sure that they're based and founded in very objective data, either that's collected and aggregated through our PEAK platform, or that we produce ourselves where we find that data does not exist. So today what we're going to be talking about is the relationship between energy access and jobs, the energy access workforce. So what I'm going to do is just take us through. Let's see, how do I advance my slides? There we go. So what I'm going to do is take us through a motivation for this, our latest campaign, give you an overview of what the campaign looks like up to today, and then I'll talk about our research and some of the research highlights, and then as Camria said, we'll stop for a period of question and answer and discussion of potential next steps together. Really looking forward to hopefully partnering with some of those on the. So motivation for our Powering Jobs work. Well, as many of you on the phone who are probably in the energy access space know, the renewable energy sector sort of mainstream as it relates to energy and electricity access strategies and plans for a lot of the emerging markets that we're all concerned about today. Some of our latest statistics suggest that up to 20,000 dairy companies would be needed to power SDG 7 by 2030. That means that the off-grid value chain could really create as many as 4.5 million jobs globally. And that's including everything from sales and installation to servicing, appliances, etc. That's a number that comes from IRENA. What IRENA also notes is that most renewable energy jobs, however, are outside of those very low energy access countries that we're serving. In fact, less than 1% of those jobs are in Africa. So there's a gap in the technical, financial, and managerial skills needed locally for distributed renewable energy technologies to scale up in low energy access countries. So that's one major challenge that we see towards achieving Sustainable Development Goal 7, universal energy access, is that we need decentralized renewables, as Will said in the introduction. We feel, Power4All feels that we need decentralized renewables to be part of that broader solution set because of how agile they are and how quickly they're able to reach very remote communities. But there's a skills gap locally. Meanwhile, there's a second challenge that we're noticing, and that is, of course, the unemployment challenge. Unemployment, as we probably all know on the phone, is a major issue across sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. And youth unemployment in particular is a major challenge, and in fact stands at 10% in India and almost 20% in Kenya and Nigeria. The World Bank in its jobless growth report actually warned that India needs as many as 8 million jobs per year to satisfy the number of young people who come on stream looking for work. That number is as much as 10 million in Africa. So we have these joint challenges of achieving Sustainable Development Goal 7, universal energy access, and Sustainable Development Goal 8, decent work and economic. And what's become interesting to us through this work with our 300 plus partners, as we mentioned, is that decentralized renewable energy technologies might actually sit at the nexus of those two SDGs. So what we decided to do was create a campaign around this entire idea. Focused on awareness, advocacy, and activation. In terms of awareness, what we decided to do was understand what are the data that show the actual jobs opportunities created in energy markets and what are they. We did that, and we did an extensive literature review of both the gray and the white literature, meaning both peer-reviewed and non-peer-reviewed literature about energy and jobs. There's actually very little literature that explores this topic. So we felt that part of the campaign had to be us doing the work of developing a baseline to understand the relationship between energy access and jobs. So that's our first step, was awareness, the data and the communications that show that DRE markets can actually create social positive impact on energy access and employment. The next layer, if you will, of our campaign is around advocacy and trying to grow support within targeted institutions for the finance, for the policy, and the programmatic support that would lead to DRE training and education as directed and dictated by the recommendations that come out of the research. And then finally is activation. And that's straight these for work to youth and to women, and to connect the skills needs for DRE to the energy sector more broadly. And so that's what Powering Jobs, I'm sure many of you by now have seen the hashtag Powering Twitter, your LinkedIn, etc. That's really what this is about. It's trying to understand are there ways to help solve both SDG 7 and SDG 8 together? And if so, what are the gaps in the middle? What is the job creation opportunity for decentralized renewables? What are the technical and vocational skills there? And how do we solve those? So that's what we're powering jobs in this campaign. So we have a great community of action that supports us in this campaign. We have a series of global partners and then a series of country partners. And we decided to start our work. As I mentioned before, we realized that there's very little data to draw from that actually sort of explores the relationship between energy access and jobs. And so we decided to start in 3 specific countries. And I'm going to talk about why we selected India, Kenya, Nigeria in just a second. As you can see here, our global partners include Schneider Electric, IRENA, CLASP, CEW, AMDA, UN Women, and Youth in Energy, as well as ILO, IEA, World Bank, IFC, World Energy Council. And then we have a series of local partners in each country that helped us conduct the research. Funding came from Schneider Electric and graciously from the Rockefeller Foundation. Let me give you a bit of a timeline of how we got to the point that we are at now, and then I'll start the research scope. So we launched our survey and this campaign in 2018, so last year, and then basically a quarter full of data collection with our partners on the ground in each country. We then launched the campaign itself at IREC in Singapore. This was in Q4 of last year. And once our data was collected from our countries, we had a series of focus group discussions, also at the end of last year. A lot of data analysis, drafted our report, and convened our global and country steering committees. And just recently, last week, in fact, we launched the report and the round tables in India, Kenya, Nigeria. Our next steps are to follow up with all of the partners that we were able to connect with through that report launch to drive local action and support, and begin the launch the survey for 2019. So let me take you through our research scope. What essentially we were trying to do with this exercise that forms the basis of the campaign is understand, as I mentioned before, the relationship between decentralized renewables and jobs creation. Again, as I said before, the literature is really scarce here. What we normally find are statistics like the one that I cited from IRENA earlier on, that use high-level analyses to come up with estimates. There to date are no comprehensive distributed renewable energy technology surveys or pieces of research that do a population bottom up, so that we have very accurate estimates of employment and employment factors. Employment factor, I mean the number of jobs that come from a unit of sales or a unit of product installed. So that's what we set out to do with this survey. We reached out to partners in 3 countries, India, Kenya, and Nigeria, because these 3 countries represent very different scales and ages of decentralized renewable energy market. India, of course, having a very well-established decentralized renewable energy market, and Nigeria being the newest entry of the 3. And so in each of those 3 countries, we developed a survey instrument, and then with our local research partners, we reached out to as many local decentralized renewable energy companies as possible. We did that through a database that was created by pulling together company databases across all of our steering committee members and our research partners. In terms of the scope of the companies that we surveyed, we are trying to cover the gamut of the decentralized renewable energy value chain, specifically because, again, there's very little data that takes a comprehensive look at the sector. We might find a report or 2 that looks at Pico Solar, or a report or 2 that looks at mini-grids, but we wanted to have a singular baseline using the same type of survey instrument across the sector. So we look at everything from Pico Solar appliances through to solar home systems, productive use appliances, commercial and industrial standalone systems, and mini-grid systems. So we reached out to companies across that broad array through our survey. Once we collected the data back, we have then divided up into, actually, let me just talk through the job scope and then I'll get to the value chain scope. In terms of the jobs that we asked about in the survey, we are collecting information on direct jobs. So direct jobs are those jobs that come directly, obviously, from working with decentralized renewable energy companies that are formally established in a country. Within direct jobs, there's two different sort of branches, if you will. There's direct jobs, i.e. direct contract with one of these companies, and then informal work with these companies. So an example might be an employee, a full-time employee, a distribution at a solar home system company, and that's a formal job, whereas an informal job might be a sales agent on a sort of a temporary basis that is selling the product. We also explored productive use jobs. Again, these branch into formal and informal parts of the sector. And these we define as jobs that are created through or stimulated by access to electricity. So of all of the companies that we've just talked about, once consumers and customers do have access, doing with that access, what kinds of companies and startups are being created, et cetera, and what are the jobs that come out of that. And we looked at indirect jobs. And these are upstream of the DRE sector. So that is companies that are involved in manufacturing, wholesale distribution, or that provide services to the DRE companies themselves. For instance, finance and software platform solutions or microfinance solutions to customers. So those are the three types of job categories that we tried to cover in the scope of our report, directly through the survey instrument for direct jobs, through the literature and our focus groups for productive use, and through the literature where possible for indirect jobs. What we haven't had a chance to look at is induced jobs, and those are jobs that trickle down from those direct formal and informal jobs that we described earlier. The spending of that money in an economy obviously induces other types of jobs, and so that's a far different sort of macroeconomic study that we have not included in the scope of this survey. So to tell you a little bit about the sample. As I said, we put the survey out to 3 countries, and we got back 139 respondents, just under 40 in India, and 53 in Kenya, and 51 in Nigeria. And these companies break down according to what you see here on the left-hand side. We found that a lot of companies worked across DRE technology types. So, even though we tried to survey for those technologies I mentioned in the slide before, what we found is that there are actually many companies that don't limit themselves to one particular type of DRE technology and work across the gamut. So that made processing the results a little bit tricky. And what we've done is we've grouped companies according to their primary characteristics, and those 5 groupings are as follows. End user product providers, solar appliances and other DRE products to end users themselves. Second, product developers and installers whose revenue comes mainly from developing projects who operate and maintain mini-grid systems. So the slight difference there is that project developers and installers are generally CNI companies that will build but not maintain and operate, whereas mini-grid operators we're classifying as those that continue to operate and maintain systems as part of their core business model. Fourthly, manufacturing and upstream supply chain companies, as I mentioned earlier. These are the indirect companies whose core business is in manufacturing, assembly, import, and wholesale. And then finally, sector service providers provide their services such as microfinancing, metering, software, etc. So these are the 5 groupings, and I'm going to be referring to these terms over and over again in the presentation. In terms of the study outputs, what we were able to do is a couple of things. First, basically from the survey, what we're able to understand is from the sample, which is, to our knowledge, the largest sample that exists on decentralized renewable energy technologies for sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia. What we're able to do with that sample is develop employment factors. As I mentioned before, basically an employment factor helps us understand the number of jobs that are produced or created from a unit of sale or a unit of installment. So we are able to take those employment factors and then multiply them by market estimates for the country. And with that, we then come up with full-time direct formal job estimates at the national level. We're able to do the same for informal jobs, i.e. estimate at the national level, and for productive use jobs as well. Fourthly, we're able to project future employment available market forecasts, although not available for every technology, and I'm going to explain that in a second. So that was us being able to estimate jobs and project jobs into the future. The survey also gave us a rich understanding of what the workforce itself looks like. So we're able to break apart and understand youth participation in the workforce, job function breakdown, recruitment challenges, wages and compensation across different company types, and the level of engagement. And then finally, out of the survey itself and also a series that we held in each of the 3 countries to help validate the data, we have a series of key recommendations for the sector on building local capacity, on gender inclusion and youth employment. So that's what we're going to get into right now. This is a wordy slide, but what I wanted to do was just tell you up front before getting into the graphs what we found as some of our key takeaways. And then I'm going to go to the graphs after this slide and kind of break this down. So there were 5 key takeaways for us from the data that came out of the surveys. First is that across all 3 of our focus countries, clearly the decentralized renewable energy sector is already a jobs engine. I can say that because what we found is that in 2017 to 2018, the sector provides as many as 95,000 direct formal jobs in India, 10,000 in Kenya, and 4,000 in Nigeria. In each of those countries, that's comparable to some of the largest, renewable energy sector employment numbers that we know of, and the utility sector numbers that we know of. So in India, for instance, we found that 92,000, the on-grid solar sector, utility scale solar sector creates about 92,000 jobs a year. We found that in Kenya, the local utility company, KPLC, employs 11,000 formally every year. And then in Nigeria, we found that the electricity, gas, and steam sector, this is according to national official statistics, employs, again, another 10,000 direct and formally every year. So we're already on the scale, as you can see, or the order of magnitude as these utility scale sectors. That's number 1. Number 2, what we found was that the dairy sector actually has a much bigger impact when you consider the informal sector and the productive use sector. So even though the direct jobs are already making an impact, what we found is that in the same year, the sector provided as many as 200,000 informal jobs in India, 15,000 in Kenya, and 10,000 in Nigeria. So that's almost doubling in the case of Kenya, and more than doubling in the case of India and Nigeria, the direct formal jobs. In terms of productive use, what we found is that the sector is then providing as many as almost 500,000 in India, 65,000 in Kenya, and 15,000 in Nigeria. So clearly these 2 sectors, the informal job sector and the productive use sector, need a lot more information and a lot more attention. Third, what we found is that when we project out to 2023, a few years in the future, things might change a little bit as mini-grids might grow to be one of the more important dairy employers. We found that currently sales, the end users, so the Pico Solar and companies currently are the largest jobs creator of the sector. But given that so many countries have mini-grid targets that are very ambitious, what that suggests is that the might shift in the future. I'm going to come back and talk about the assumptions that are embedded there in terms of what might actually be achievable in all of these countries in a second. In terms of skilled demand, what we found is that sales and distribution make up 40% of Kenya's dairy skills. And this we also in India, whereas in Nigeria, the skills demand was really in the development and operations phase. Fifthly, what we found was that across All company types, management and business administration represents a major skills gap. These types of jobs make up more than 20% of the workforce, but more importantly than the percentage of the workforce that they make up is what all companies, or most companies, said, which is that this is one of the most difficult talents to recruit for. Business soft skills were identified as a major skills gap across all functions. Business soft skills being different from managerial skills, where with business soft skills we're talking about health and safety, sexual harassment, strategic planning, those kinds of general soft skills. All companies that we spoke to or that responded to us and in the focus groups identified this as a major gap that's not limited to any particular job function, but that is affecting sort of performance across the companies as a whole. And then lastly, we found that participation of women in the dairy sector is quite low. It's 23% of total direct formal jobs on average across the 3 countries. And that's even lower than the global renewable energy sector's 32%. Youth participation, however, is high. Engagement through informal work was also, I'll talk about that in a second. So this is a summary of some of the key findings, and now we're going to dive into a little bit more detail. So here's a graph that looks at our job estimates for 2017 to, as you can see, and as I mentioned earlier, we have our 3 countries, India, Kenya, Nigeria. You can see the direct formal, informal, and the productive use jobs in the 3 different colors in the concentric circles. In India, across all 3 countries, the scale of the DRE direct formal workforce is already on the order of the utility renewable energy sector in India, national utility, and the electricity, gas, and steam sector in Nigeria. Here's our projections into 2022-2023. Again, as you can see, very large for India. And Nigeria, the direct formal jobs, and then in Kenya, what's larger is the informal jobs. This is because of the change that we might see in the future of what mini grids, of what the sort of the balance between mini grids and solar home systems might look like in these 3 countries. In India, there's a very aggressive policy scheme for mini grids across several states that might push mini grids to be a very significant jobs employer. In our survey, what we did is we basically developed a high mini grid penetration scenario and a low mini grid penetration scenario to understand what the range of jobs might look like. What we found is that while direct formal jobs will differ quite a bit, informal jobs stay high regardless of how many mini grids, of what the mini grid projection looks like. We did the same for Kenya and Nigeria, projecting out into the future. And again, for Nigeria, because it's a very aggressive mini grid plan, the numbers do change quite a bit. I have a number of slides on the projections and the assumptions that were used for those future market estimates in the appendix. So just get through these slides, and if we want to cover more detail, we can do that afterwards. So let's move into the workforce trends and what the sector's profile looks like. That the sector provides high-skilled, full-term jobs. In fact, more than 2/3 of the workforce is skilled and full-time, and the average retention is more than 30 months, whereas the average retention for the utility sector in India just doesn't is less than a year. So you can see here from the left hand moving to the right hand, the graph showing our skilled labor, level of engagement, and average retention. The level of skill is quite high across all 3. And this is because these are the types of jobs across companies are, sales and distribution, which is quite skilled, even in the informal space, technical assistance and after-sales service, project development, operations, and maintenance. So these are all, very high-skilled types of jobs, and as much as 60% of the sector is skilled labor across the board. Level of engagement we define as the nature of work, whether it's full-time, part-time, or contract-based. And again, we were surprised to find that most of the direct formal employment across all 3 countries is full-time work, which is really interesting to note. And not only is it full-time work, but these are high retention jobs. So you can see on the far right what retention looks like across countries and across the full-time formal worker types. So obviously for the full-time employment, the retention is quite high, and for the informal work, the is high. So we see those jobs lasting only as many as 10 months, 12 months in the case of Kenya and Nigeria, but in India, informal work seems to also have a very high retention. In terms of women's and youth, what we find is that women, as I mentioned earlier, account for less than 30% of the direct formal jobs of the entire sector. You can see the breakdown for female employers and then informal workers for all 3 countries on the left-hand side. So we have female employees, managers, and informal workers. What we found is that there isn't much difference between female employees and women as managers. Both of those groupings, the percentage participation is very low, around, as I mentioned, less than 30%. What was interesting to note for us is that in the informal sector, women make up more than half of the workforce in India. In fact, it's 60% of the workforce. So we found companies saying in the focus groups that this is because women are a very integral part of social networks, especially in rural communities. And so getting product sold and marketed to women is really a key part of the solar home system and Pico solar appliance sector. For mini-grid developers, they had the lowest level of, project development and installers, they had the lowest level of women's participation at less than 10%. Youth participation was high across all 3 countries, highest in India and very high also in Kenya. Another thing that we found statistical significance around was the difference in youth participation across company types. We found that in Kenya, for instance, local companies tended to hire more young persons than foreign companies. If I hadn't mentioned it before, the definition that we use for youth are persons aged between 15 and 24. So now we're looking at what the job function breakdown or the skills breakdown looks like for 2017 to 2018 across the 3 countries. And as you can see, in India, in Nigeria, there's more than 20% of the sector is in management and business administration. We have many smaller companies that have sort of have a larger management and administration base. And in India, we have a lot more larger developed companies, and so the management and business administration impact of footprint is a little bit lower. In Nigeria, as I mentioned before as well, we have a lot of project development and installation jobs, especially because in Nigeria, the solar home system and mini-grid sectors are a little bit more nascent, but already taken off is standalone solar systems. And so there's a lot of jobs being created in that space or in that job function. And also because that is sort of non-standardized work, that also is more intensive, and that helps us understand why that's such a big part of the Nigerian workforce landscape. In Kenya, as you can see, many of you on the phone probably know that Kenya it's a huge solar home system market. And so in Kenya and also in India, you can see that sales and distribution, on the contrary, are where most of the jobs are, again, supporting sales and distribution of those end user products. And then across all 3 countries, after sales service is sizable and is likely to be more so in the future, according to our focus group experts who say that, especially in Kenya and India, where that solar home system market is already so mature, moving into this after sales support and into the support of customers that want larger devices is likely to be where the sector goes. So for each country, basically what we have for each country, a breakdown of the entire workforce profile. So here I'm just using Kenya as an example, but if you take a look at each of our country reports, we published we launched and published all 3 of them last week. You'll find all of this information for India and also for Nigeria. We're just using Kenya as an example. So what you can do is now we can walk through a profile for each of these companies, get end user product providers, and you'll see going down the left-hand side, we understand for this particular company type what worker engagement looks like, what the job function breakdown looks like, and the balance breakdown looks like, what the skills and what the age breakdown looks like. So for end user product providers, as I was just mentioning earlier, you can see that the big chunk of the job function of the jobs are in sales and distribution. We can see that the gender balance is, as I mentioned before, fairly low. It's about 25%, as you can see here, and that the skills are quite high. So about half of this sector is skilled labor. Just as another example, for the product developers and installers, you can see that the workforce profile looks very different. The gender balance here, as I mentioned, is much lower, and we have more jobs in project installation. And we have more skilled labor. And then for, again, a little bit different. We have a larger portion of the mini-grid workforce in management and business, a better gender breakdown, strong skills breakdown in terms of highly skilled. And as you can see here in the last bar, mini-grids, interestingly, had a really high percentage of youth employees. Getting to the end of our research now, you can see a job in the future. Since we have the workforce profile of each of our companies, we can map our employment factors for 2017, 2018 into the future and understand what the company breakdown would look like, and their breakdown for each of those companies would look like. Now, workforce trends tend to change over time as companies grow. Sometimes those trends can even reverse. As you get larger and have economies of scale, you can employ less. So we really wanted to emphasize that this is just a snapshot and a potential glance at what things might look like into the future. What we really need to do is be collecting data over the long term, so doing longitudinal studies to understand what trajectories and differences in behavior look like over time, and which is why we want to do this study again next year and the year after that and the year after that. But using what we know from 2017 to 2018, just as a snapshot of what things might look like in the future, you can see here what the skills breakdown would look like. And in India, we'd have a move more towards the operation and maintenance space and project development and installation, as I said before, given the growth of the mini-grid sector. In Kenya, solar home systems are going to still continue to dominate the market, and then sort of an even spread across the sector. So this all leads us to a series of insights and recommendations, and this will be my last slide before handing back over to Camria. So basically what comes out of all of this information and this data, and what comes out of the focus groups where we had experts help us validate and provide newest insights, are a couple of insights and recommendations. First is that clearly there's a skills need to be that needs to be unlocked so that the DRE can reach scale, and that represents an opportunity for collaboration in academia, training institutions, and industry associations. In particular, and interestingly, managerial skills are in high demand. In the launch that we had just last week in Kenya, this came as a really welcome news to many of the persons who were in the room, who mentioned, we often associate decentralized renewable energy and the energy sector in general with engineering and with technical skills. But what we're seeing here is that the sector is saying what we really need is good managers for these companies. Alongside the technical skills and managerial skills, dairy companies reported that general soft business skills were critically lacking, affecting every aspect of company performance. As I mentioned earlier on, these include leadership, finance, strategic planning, communications, chain of command, project management. So all of those skills that are needed across the board by every member of your company, every employee of your company, for it to be successful. That represents potentially an opportunity for some of our industry associations and the donors that support these types of companies to get involved and help to create curricula that solve this challenge. Thirdly, there's clearly an opportunity for further youth engagement. The lack of awareness on opportunities offered by the sector, the lack of youth experience, and the lack of established pipelines for youth recruitment were what came out of the survey as some of the key challenges to engaging more youth. So that's obviously a space where universities and TVET institutions can get directly involved, work directly with industry and the DRE sector itself to help develop, again, curricula, apprenticeship programs, training programs, encourage more understanding and awareness of industry opportunities during degrees themselves. So there's a lot of opportunity for universities and TVET institutions to work directly with industry to help create more awareness about the opportunities that exist for young people entering the job force. Second to last, there's clearly a clear need for greater participation of women in the workforce, not just for gender balance, but interestingly, a lot of companies told us that encouraging women's participation in the labor force would actually benefit their companies financially. Again, as said in the solo home system space, women are critical to the retail and distribution value chain. But also what we heard from many good companies is that because entrepreneurship has become such a core part of their business model, and creating entrepreneurs out of energy access is so core, encouraging women to take up those kinds of positions because women are the ones that are generally at home. Sorry about that. Because women are the ones that are generally available and engaging with the energy access at home, creating entrepreneurship opportunities for women in particular is important. Also, we heard that because social of communities, women encouraging others in the community to, explore different types of agri-value chains, such as honey or etc., is really critical. And so the mini-grid companies felt that there's really a need for finding ways to encourage more participation of women in the workforce. We found that from the survey and from the focus groups, companies felt that the challenges of engaging women in the workforce stem into the challenges of incorporating women into STEM fields more generally. And so there's a lot of opportunity there, again, for universities, TVET institutions, industry, and financiers to work together to challenges. Finally, as I mentioned earlier, we saw that the sector has a massive footprint in the informal space and a more massive footprint in the productive use sector. So that really represents an opportunity to create direct training interventions for the agri-value chains and other sort of, commercial value chains that come out of or are stimulated by access to energy in rural communities. This is critical since rural unemployment is such a serious challenge, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. And so creating training programs that directly, target those agri-value chains and support entrepreneurs, whether it's with business skills or with, again, soft skills or with the technical skills that they need to operate machinery, those are all needed. Something else that came out of the focus groups was that this also represents is an opportunity for the DRE sector to step up in terms of the formalization of labor to align with local and international decent work standards, compensation standards, and social protection for more workers. So those are some of just the skipping the iceberg of some of the recommendations that come out of this data set. It's a really rich data set, and I encourage everyone to take a look at the report and the in-country reports, which sort of break down according to the company types. As I mentioned before, what we want to do is continue this survey into the future so that we can more types of companies, so that we can expand to more, and so that we can create this longitudinal understanding of how business and the DRE sector changes over time.